Welcome to Gloves Off, a performative debate about DIY labs and citizen science. This lively performative panel features a formidable group of experts who will address a host of issues relevant to DIY labs and citizen science that include some of the dangers and assets to the public that such labs present.
Gloves Off probes who can and should produce scientific knowledge and where it should be produced. Should it be in the hands only of experts? And are the individuals performing citizen science adequately representative of our culture? Asking whether science should be home-brewed, professional, or hybrid are key questions.
Patricia Olenek, my co-chair, is a multimedia artist who explores how technology, social systems, and institutional structures shape our understanding of the world. She is an endowed professor at Washington University in St. Louis and inaugural Medicine plus Media Arts Fellow at UCLA's ArtSci Center. Patricia co-directs Laser Talks with me in New York City.
And my co-host, Ellen K. Levy, PhD, is a New York-based multimedia artist and writer whose focus is complex systems. Bloomsbury Press published her co-edited anthology, Darcy Wentworth Thompson's Generative Influences in Art Design and Architectures in 21. She co-edits the Routledge book series on art and science since 1750.
For this performative debate, we have assembled three debaters, Jill Scott, Piroska Kopar, and Alex Pearlman, who will each lay out their position either for or against citizen science, artists, and labs, or propose a more neutral or referee position on this complex topic.
Our first debater is Jill Scott, PhD, an artist, teacher, and context provider in the field of art, science, and technology interactions. Her research spans neuroscience, electronics, ecology, sociology, sculpture, performative installation, and also media art.
Our second debater is Dr. Piroska Kopar, who joined the School of Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis in 2018 as assistant professor in trauma, acute and critical care surgery. The same year, she was named director for the Center for Humanism and Ethics in Surgical Specialties, known as CHESS, at the university.
And our third debater is Alex Pearlman, a bioethicist and independent journalist who writes on the intersections of health policy and emerging technologies. In addition to reporting for major national and international outlets, Pearlman is a research affiliate with the MIT Media Lab's Community Biotechnology Initiative and a researcher in the University of Pennsylvania's lab. And our respondents are Paul Miller, AKA DJ Spooky, and Sidharth Ramakrishnan, who will both respond.
Our first respondent, Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, is a composer, multimedia artist, and writer whose work immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, and environmental and social issues. His performance pieces include Rebirth of a Nation and Pioneers of African American Cinema, a collection of the earliest films made by African American directors. It was released in 2015.
And Sidharth Ramakrishnan, PhD, a neuroscientist and assistant professor of biology, and the Jeannie M. Carruthers Chair in Neuroscience at the University of Puget Sound. His research interests span the field of developmental biology, neuroendocrinology, and sensory motor integration. Debaters will also have an opportunity to respond in turn to respondents. So let's begin. Jill Scott.
Hello, thanks very much for the invitation. And it's quite a controversial, interesting topic. And I'd like to begin with a question, actually, about the differences, really, between artists in labs, citizen scientists and citizen science, and DIY biolabs. And the differences are really about procedure, different objectives, different methods, different outcomes, and different, perhaps, tools. So these are really important kind of categories, I think, to start to make this analysis between the different fields of interest. A lot of these fields of interest, well, the three of them, are often led by people who are interested in the democratization of science and moving out, breaking down these boundaries between art and science. So just a little bit about my background and why I'm interested in this, these differences and these questions surrounding these different areas of practice. I founded in 2002 an Artist in Labs program at the University of the Arts in Zurich. And the program was really about encouraging the collaboration of interdisciplinary research. And after securing hosts from like 10 Swiss science labs in biology, physics, and computer science, and enticing proposals for over 150 international artists, I soon realized that the main challenge for both artists and scientists was to think outside of their disciplinary boxes and their comfort zones, and explore potentials of combining, I would say, objective with subjective approaches. So our aims were really educational and experiential in nature. And I think that's the case with all of these scenarios. The Artist in Labs, the Citizen Science, and the Bio Labs are all about experiential, hands-on potentials to break down these boundaries between disciplines. So we wanted to give artists what's called a tacit opportunity, and that's something that all these areas too share as well. This hands-on tacit experience would give them the possibility to develop their interpretations, to be immersed inside a culture of science, actually, and to allow them to look at the solid raw materials, the pertinent debates, and the scientific tools of the labs. They could also attend relevant lectures and conferences held by scientists themselves. But the process also helped the scientists, and it helped the scientists in that they could gain insight into the world of contemporary arts, media, aesthetic development, and very, very important, into the semiotics of communication that are used by artists in order to reach out to the public. Today, the program still encourages this further collaboration between both parties, including an extension of discourse and an exchange of research practices and methodologies. But right now, what's happened is this sort of, I would say, movement started a long time ago with EAT, which is an experimental art and engineering group of putting artists and scientists together in the 50s. And now it's much more grown now into many possibilities of artists being accepted into science labs. But it's also the initiatives coming from the science side. Scientists are becoming more interested in communication, more interested in opening up. Younger people in science particularly. I mean, we had an event just a while ago, so many scientists turn up for it to come to an art event. So all these audiences and these issues are becoming mixed. And part of that is the sharing of the kind of democratization of science. So the differences for me between, there's very big similarities, but there's also differences. So for example, in the procedures, if you go as an artist into a lab, you've got to follow very strict safety rules and monitored regulations. If you want to be a citizen scientist, then you're a part of a team that learns about natural systems and tries to help science gather material and like bring that material to fruition for scientific research. But if you're in a DIY lab, your procedure is about trying to figure out how to break rules and how to kind of think about things in a different way entirely from the norm. So this is quite interesting in terms of procedure. And the objectives in the Artist in Labs are about learning, about being present in the debates, about breaking down the boundaries. But the objectives in biolabs are really about thinking about manufacturing, control living cells, constructing biomaterials. They're very physical. The majority of biolabs, certainly DIY biolabs, are looking particularly at physical potentials of materials. And in methods, they differ again. The methods of science would be that, you know, when you're an artist in lab, you're part of the incredible research of understanding how we work, how we think, nature, how it functions, interactions. But when you're in a citizen science group and you're going out collecting data for scientists, you're probably interested in natural systems generally, and you're also interested to help science gather material for their own research. And the objectives in the Artists in Labs programs are really about communication. Communication is one of the main issues, whereas in the other two, in citizen science and DIY biolabs, I'm not too sure whether that's the main objection. In relation to biolabs, I think there's a possibility to have different methods. So the methods also are quite different right now between these three areas. The methods in the Artists in Labs are about trying to figure out how you can combine subjective and objective processes using the tools of art like media, photography, painting, sculpture, to actually bring those to fruition, to bring the communication to another stage. Whereas the methods in citizen science are really about monitoring, observation, probably photography as well, but it's quite a different kind of objective. And the DIY groups are much more about breaking rules and trying to discover new methods and new methodologies. And the outcomes are different as well. In Artists in Labs, the outcomes are really, I mean, our focus in the Artists in Labs is really to get to the public, to have exhibitions, to have outreach programs, to have educational initiatives. Whereas in the citizen science groups, it's really about cumulative data. I mean, there's artists who also work in citizen science, like Brandon Melange, who see citizens as collectors and discoverers of information. It's teamwork, and it's based on very much on teamwork. And whereas when you go into the outcomes of biolabs, particularly DIY biolabs, you see an interest in biofuels, bioplastics, inks, microscopes, incubators made out of styrofoam, energies, measurement devices. You know, you see all these different kinds of outcomes that are about making things cheaply and more available for society. So I think what's interesting is to see that these three things are also now very much concerned with the tools, and by using those tools, the regulations and the issues that relate to those tools. So when you are an artist and you go into a science lab, you're very much under the ethics and the control of that lab, and you have to abide by the rules, otherwise you can't stay. I think citizens in citizen science might discover new things in their reports and in their behavior, and I think that's interesting enough, but they are also somewhat governed by the scientists who have engaged these citizens in order to collect data. Whereas the issues in biolabs are still open for negotiation. Security measures are yet to be put in place. There's a lot of ethics and codes around how to, or trying to build those new ethics. There's meetings between those labs to try and figure out how they should assemble and access materials. The outcomes right now are, I mean, they do have access to raw GM materials. They can assemble data via bricks. They have access to do that. They can make lab tools cheaply, for example, as I said, with incubators, microscopes. But of course, artificial organisms are difficult to produce, and there's a lot of controversy about trying to produce those. So this is, I think, just to give an overview of the differences between all those three different components. And I mean, people do say that DIY bio is citizen science. Well, it is a kind of citizen science. But when we talk about collecting data for scientists, that's quite a different kind of role. So that, for me, is more of a definition of a citizen scientist.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, so now I just want to say that, like, just to tell you, since about 2016, CRISPR for DIY biolabs is readily available. They can buy CRISPR plasmids, which equals about 1,000 biobricks, and they can put those together, and then they can use bacteria or yeast to see what happens when they're expressed in particular kinds of incubated scenarios. They need a lot of extra material to do that, like they need to buy a slice, a cloning extract, and they need to look at what's available. There are kits available, but there's nothing available like, for example, what a scientist recently did in China, where he used CRISPR on human embryos. Yeah, so it takes an enormous amount of tech lab facilities to do something like that. Yeah, so this sort of availability opens up the discourse about the security and biosafety of DIY biolabs.
That's fantastic. Wow, very thought-provoking. Thank you, Jill.
Okay.
Piroska, would you like to follow up?
Absolutely. Thank you for including me in this panel. Let me stretch as I'm coming up in the fight. And then let me see if I can share my screen here and make it bigger. All right. So, again, thank you for having me. I am going to talk about my position on the debate about DIY labs and citizen science. And I really do appreciate Jill's distinction. I do feel that any kind of collaboration is always very helpful. It is when people get siloed into very narrow fields that I think things get very dangerous. And that's sort of my worry about DIY labs or certain citizen science. So my position about it is, should people do this? And let me see if absolutely no. And so I might be subtle about it, but I feel very strongly, no. I think about my own training, which is a trauma surgeon, which of course is different, but I have trained for 24 years to become a trauma surgeon. And I just imagine somebody thinking, oh, let me try that at home. That doesn't work. And what about when the outcome that you're controlling is not just that one person in front of you in the operating room, but an entire population or an entire group? And just as COVID is coming back again in full force, I'm also an intensivist. So the nightmare of people trying to have home remedies and then coming into the hospital with terrible after effects just strengthens my very strong feeling of no, this should not be done outside of controlled environment. This is Otto Hahn, who is one of the people who was credited with discovery of fission for nuclei. And the question I always think about the question, what are we responsible for what we create? Are we responsible for the outcome? As surgeons, that's all we care about. We don't really care too much about how did you suture this? How did you staple that? What we care about is, did the patient do well? It's really interesting because Jill was just talking about how the process, the actual experience of the artist and the lab person collaborating can be so important. But I tend to think, but you should be also responsible for what you bring about as an after effect. And of course, the after effect of this discovery we're all familiar with was the nuclear bomb. And to this day, should we just share this button with other people? The nuclear explosion should probably not be easily available to the public. It should probably be controlled in some ways. And I feel no differently about DIY labs. So let's just talk about, what are we talking about exactly? Let's talk about the exact technology and what am I worried about? So CRISPR that Jill just briefly mentioned is a technology where we actually splice or cut genes and parts of genes in order to get a different result. So this is touted as sort of a cure-all potential. On their website, they are saying that they can cure blood disorders, they can cure cancer, they can cure neurologic disorders. And so one of the sort of diseases that is always talked about is, for example, sickle cell anemia, because you can just have one targeted thing that you change and then you don't have the disease. And that all sounds wonderful. But how does that process come about? How do the experiments work? And what are the costs, both moral, financial, and live costs of those experiments? On the CRISPR Technologies website, this I copied from there, it says, we encourage patients to participate in clinical trials of our investigational therapies whenever possible. And this brings me to a very important ethical point. People think that when something is new, it's better. And this happens a lot in cancer research. It happens a lot in clinical trials. But just because something is new doesn't mean it's been proven to be better. So there is good science in terms of it is a well-done science. And there is good science in terms of, is this contributing to the good of the people? And good science in methodology, at least in the traditional labs, the best thing you can have is a randomized, double-blinded controlled trial. What does that mean? It means that all these people above the dice are just random people who want to participate in this experiment, and then they'll be randomized to either A arm or B arm. And you notice A arm would get the injection, say, of whatever it would, maybe the CRISPR technology would be used on them. And the B group would get placebo, meaning it would just be a water pill or a vitamin that they would get, and they wouldn't even know it. They are blinded to this condition. So at least half of the people who are interested are not even going to get the exposure to the treatment that we are talking about. Not to mention that it's probably not going to work for everyone in the A group either. So what people fail to realize is that just because it glitters and just because it's new, A, in a clinical trial format, you very well may not be exposed to it. And B, the reason there is a trial is because we don't yet know if it's going to work. So the therapeutic misconception refers to this idea that you just because it's that you think it's therapeutic, but actually it's still in the phase of being studied and experimented on. And the very nature of that means you don't know the outcome. You have no idea. And think about, we have to get new, better, bigger. And the outcomes of that can be a little bit scary. Let me see. Let me know if I'm freezing again. Okay, so for example, this is the schema for an ECMO machine. And this is very relevant right now because this is how we treat people who are very affected by COVID and they can't breathe for themselves anymore. And even the ventilator is not enough. Their lungs are so terrible that they don't work anymore. And so what we are looking at here is that the blood is actually sucked out of the patient, and then goes through an oxygen filter, and that functions as the lung of the patient. It warms the blood back up and puts it right back in the patient. It's kind of like when people get open cardiac or heart surgery. This is how the blood gets circulated while their heart is being worked on. So this is called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenator. Why am I pointing this out? Because this is a very clever way of keeping someone alive who can't breathe. And sometimes it can also take the function of the heart. But then just look at the outcome. This is a patient on ECMO. This is a primitive version of ECMO. Look at all the lines and tubes. And the question is, this is clever. It is actually, it can save lives. But are there maybe sometimes fates worse than death? What are the limits of us pushing the natural boundaries of things that may actually be harmful to people? Is this a life you would want? So that's what I mean by when I say is it good science in terms of actually bringing about a good change instead of committing, in some ways, some terrible things. So let's see. And of course, the designer baby problem is just around the corner for the CRISPR technology. And one of the things that's so interesting about that problem is that if you think about it, the access that we already have such a differential access to new technologies, and it's just going to be logarithmically increased, because who is going to be able to design their babies? Obviously the wealthy. And what are they going to do? They're going to design presumably healthy, strong babies. And then that is going to just reflect or make much bigger the gap between those who have and those who have not. And are we responsible for that in a society where we're constantly talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, and yet it is our science, our research, our push that is making the difference bigger? And is that responsible as a scientific community or as a citizens community? And I just want to remind us that with a moral compass, the absolute necessities of research of any kind is oversight, accountability, and ongoing evaluation as to what are the outcomes that we're producing that were unexpected. And with that, I will give it over to our next contestant.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Piroska. Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Pearlman, and thank you so much to Patricia and Ellen for hosting this really sort of wide-ranging conversation. Very interesting. So I also, really appreciate Jill's sort of parsing the different names of communities. And I just want to add one more, and hopefully it won't be too confusing. So when we talk about DIY labs, what we're actually talking about is community biology. And as a community, folks who have launched and created so-called DIY labs in the past decade or 15 years have started to create really robust communities, interact with each other, meet up with each other, as Jill mentioned, and create what's now referred to as community biology, because they're really not doing it themselves, right? It's not you're doing it yourself. You're doing it with partners, friends, collaborators, and colleagues all over the world. And it's a really exciting time for the evolution of the movement. But ultimately, I think this conversation was meant to be about whether independent biologists, bioartists, and biohackers within the community bio movement should work in labs. But I'm not here to talk about that. Actually, I'm here to talk about science activism. Like so many movements for social justice, the global movement for community biology, which incorporates all of these camps that we've talked about, citizen scientists, biodesigners, bioartists, members of community biolabs, radicals, educators, use diverse tactics to achieve the ultimate goal, which is the democratization of scientific knowledge. So as an advocate for accessibility in the life sciences and STEAM education broadly, which is a global civil rights issue, my position takes a fairly broad approach to the concept of biomedical citizen science or community biology. It's my belief that public participation in the research enterprise not only makes sense economically, because it obviously creates massive opportunities for creativity and innovation in healthcare, but I also think that community biology can step in and plug many of the gaping holes left by the traditional triumvirate of government, academia, and industry when it comes to explaining and situating emerging technologies for a general public that is already very wary of an elitist approach from the ivory tower. So in my role as a bioethics researcher, which, yes, sometimes takes place in an ivory tower, but I'm also a journalist who works on the ground with communities. And I've worked closely for many years with biomedical citizen scientists within the community biology movement, specifically many biohackers and biodesigners. So I've observed a few key issues that I think are much more interesting to consider than the issue of who should have access to biotechnology, because that's obvious to me and it's an easy answer. Duh, anyone who wants to access scientific knowledge and biotechnology should be able to do so. Piroska is talking about quote unquote good science. To me, teaching science to those for whom it's otherwise inaccessible is good science. So to me, though, the three most pressing issues that I see in community biology is not about, again, whether or not citizens should do science in community settings. They already are, and they're doing it safely. So this global network with tens of thousands of participants is already doing great work. Rather, the questions are those related to self-governance and oversight, interactions with an out-of-date and needlessly confusing regulatory landscape that's like banging your head against a wall, and a broad misunderstanding by traditional academics of what the movement for community biology is actually about. Piroska is playing this role impeccably in this performative debate. When it comes to the goals of the movement, I want to share the Statement of Purpose 3.0, a very long and wonderful sentence that was co-created by 300 plus attendees of the Global Community Bio Summit in 2018, which is an annual meeting, which I think Jill was referring to, where members of the community bio movement regularly come together to talk about sort of what's next and how to push science forward. So I'm going to share this beautiful work of art and read it. Our intended purpose is to fundamentally transform life sciences and democratize biotechnology, to inspire creativity and improve lives by organizing life science change makers and bioenthusiasts, to build an inclusive global network, cultivate an accessible commons of knowledge and resources, launch community labs and projects, and enable local educators. This is a pretty explicit statement. It's one of many artifacts that biohackers, biodesigners, and bioenthusiasts from around the world have generated over the past decade. This is just one. But I really love it because I think it makes the community's motives crystal clear and serves to explain long-term goals, which mostly, again, align very well with other popular movements for social justice: education, community power, transparency, and positive change. So to me, this hand-wringing and panicked assumptions about biosecurity and biosafety in citizen science and community biology, which both Jill and Piroska have brought up, are unconvincing red herrings. There is a boatload of evidence from plenty of sources showing the lengths to which the community will go to self-police. Community labs around the world have made successful overtures engaging with local and international biosafety authorities, including seeking advice from experts when a novel problem arises. Having spent a lot of time around both citizen scientists and traditional researchers, it's my opinion that the independent scientists are just as, if not more, concerned with developing safe practices. And let's be clear, bad actors exist in any community, even traditional science. But the community bio movement is not interested in creating designer babies. That's traditional medicine, who are uninterested in distributive justice of assisted reproductive technologies. There is also a movement for ethics oversight of citizen science projects, and I've personally been involved with a number of research initiatives focused on this, as well as a workshop that sought to anticipate what an open source framework for a code of practice might look like if it were to be used across community bio contexts. Look, I will be the first to say that there are major hurdles standing in the way of mainstream success for these communities. And those are, unsurprisingly, time and money. But the main ways these hurdles manifest are in the total and complete failure by regulatory systems to be flexible, and by academics who refuse to recognize well-trained but independent researchers as colleagues. Getting a project into an approvals pipeline necessitates both a lot of time and a lot of money, generally in the form of lawyers. And presently, there is no track for citizen science projects that might lead to the consumer market, despite the fact that there are a number that might be ready for prime time regulatory attention. Not to mention the morass of intellectual property barriers holding up innovation in synthetic biology on the whole. Regulators, and not just in the US, must do a better job engaging with this community, understand the often non-traditional genesis of projects, and create a pathway so that creative, accessible, low-cost health interventions and educational materials developed within the communities can make it to the widest possible audience. Open source and independent research, if these barriers are dealt with, will have a massive positive impact, in addition to the science communication and local innovation, local education opportunities. Community bio can contribute to food insecurity and accessible health interventions in the developing world, make it easier and cheaper to produce affordable, overpriced pharmaceuticals, and develop materials that will be necessary as we grapple with a changing climate. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Wonderful.
So Sid, you're up.
Everybody has really done well. Sid, love to hear. I guess.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sidharth Ramakrishnan. I'm a neuroscientist, and it's been wonderful being a part of this panel and hearing from all of you. As a scientist, I feel I'm actually going to fall on the side of Alex and I feel like, especially now, it feels like the public has this vague indifference and disinterest towards science. And we've been creating more of a class divide of knowledge holders and knowledge consumers. And then there's a media, which is in the middle, which is acting as a gateway between the knowledge producers and the knowledge consumers. And we are perpetuating this class divide over and over again, instead of just opening it up and saying, you know, let's all be participatory in this generation of knowledge and creating this knowledge going forward. And part of that is also because the media gatekeepers are there. Public reaction to science produced in labs is emotional sometimes as opposed to rational. And because they have not gone through the process and the steps on like building up on how they achieve the results or what they're trying to convey. And part of that is because they're missing out on all the steps and even the training of the way of thinking and the process of it. And I feel the more participation that is there of citizen science and community science and DIY labs, I think there'll be more people involved, and therefore the reaction to this will be less emotional and a little bit more rational about it. And going back to the question of ethics that Piroska brought up, and the ethics of being under a certain ethics code in labs, maybe it happens in the field of medicine, but in the field of science, ethics is something as an afterthought. Yes, you have IRB applications for human subjects. Yes, you have IACUC applications for working with animals. But then do you really think about ethics in designing your experiment to see how ethical is this experiment when you actually, is it going to help the public? Is it going to help are you going to be generating knowledge? So the whole ethics framework is actually not baked into the lab scientist's experimental design or hypothesis generation. It's in fact almost an afterthought that's introduced by bioethicists and other people who come and say, hey, is this something you need to be thinking about? Which is why we already have these, design babies and things that are already being produced, because for a lot of engineers and scientists, it's not part of their regular training. I, as a scientist, as a professor of neuroscience, I was taught about ethics as a postdoctoral researcher, not as an undergraduate student, not as a graduate student, but as a postdoctoral researcher. So almost 15 years into my training is when I was introduced to ethics. And the first thing they talk about is plagiarism and, how to make sure your experiments go through the protocols and get approval, as opposed to, should this experiment be done, right? And in some ways, I feel like the DIY bio movement is actually thinking about that question even before trying to see, can we do this or not? Because of resource availability, because of the hard press for resources, they're actually thinking, do I have to invest all this money? Because should this experiment be done? And in a way, I think I am landing on the side of the DIY bio movement is because I work in a smaller university, which is low resource. So I actually use some of the DIY bio movement things like those microscopes and incubators that Jill was talking about. I kind of co-opt some of those techniques so that I can bring access to some of that to my undergraduates and introduce them to those kinds of tools even before, so that they can have more cheaper access to it. I was creating copper nanoparticles in the microwave because some guy on YouTube was doing it, and so yes, we follow like safety regulations with goggles and heat safety and all that, but then you are trying to co-opt some of these things because it becomes more accessible. And the democratization of access of not just technology, but also knowledge is what's most exciting, I think about this. So I think when we talk about ethics, we should also talk about ethics of access, ethics of progress, ethics of knowledge hoarding, and ethics of ignorance. So we kind of need to talk about all angles of ethics and not just the ethics of or the safety protocols or what is the effect of some of these technologies. And I think I'm trying to push towards a kind of an education structure where we don't worry about science and think more about discovery, wonder, and joy, and put it within a framework of okay, we all in this in the spirit of discovery. So how can we make it more safe but most accessible to everybody is kind of where I'm landing on. So I'm going to stop there.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
That's great, Sid. And last but not least, Paul Miller, DJ Spooky.
Okay, well, hey everybody. First and foremost, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear everyone's presentations. And Alex, it was a pleasure to hear your thoughts on bioethics. And Jill, I've really enjoyed hearing your concepts about the DIY lab and citizen science. And Sid, considering you're involved with neuroscience, I have some overlapping interests there. I'll just show you guys some stuff really quickly. This year, I'm artist in residence at Yale University coming up. And the idea is I'm just going to show you some fun imagery really quickly. They're basically, the residency is going to be focusing on computational neuroscience. So this is what you call a nitrogen-cooled supercomputer. Yale has been doing a whole series of initiatives about applied supercomputing to the arts. So I'm inspired mainly by Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, and his series of essays called The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he talks about misinformation. He helped, by the way, people tend to forget, he coined the term conspiracy theory in 1948 in this book. So conspiracy theory in the era of the pandemic, for my personal theory, and again, this might overlap with Sidharth and Alex and Jill, is that we're not just in a biological pandemic, but we're also in an information pandemic. So much of my work investigates not only just music, because I'm a music composer, but I also think about the role of pattern recognition overall in society. So I'll be doing what you call kind of issues relating to computational neuroscience and how people respond to pattern recognition, whether it be generating music. The term is called generative music. It's inspired by Brian Eno and some of the stuff he was doing in the 70s, but also other figures who are dealing with sort of an open framework of computation, like Stephen Wolfram, who's a very renowned mathematician. The book I'm working on at the moment is called Digital Fictions, and it's mainly about how algorithms shape contemporary narrative. And I'm just going to show you guys some of the stuff really quickly. So the book deals with and explores the way algorithms have become part of the foundation of everything from what some people are now calling the meme economy on over to the attention economy, on over to the idea that we're now in an era where how your attention is engaged is based on various biochemical processes. Say, for example, the serotonin and dopamine, endorphins, et cetera, released when you engage social media, clicks, likes, and so on. So many of these corporations have done a tremendous amount of research with the engagement economy. That's another term. They sorry to keep saying economies, but half the battle right now is that we're in a kind of an arms race for people's attention. And whether you look at stuff like QAnon or whether you look at the rise of Trump using social media, you can easily see there's a political dimension to this and how it can be information is weaponized in our time. So I'm also inspired by, this is a very renowned collaboration between John Cage and Sun Ra, each of whom applied what you call chance operations to their compositional strategies. John Cage, his most well-known work that inspires some of my processes is called The Imaginary Landscape. And in the late 1930s, he did the first composition for chance processes applied to kind of radio frequencies and records. And Sun Ra was a very renowned composer for free jazz. He also viewed as a forerunner for what we call Afrofuturism these days. So here's just a quote that I'm going to wrap up my presentation. This from James Joyce's Ulysses, where I just love this very concise relationship between history, sleep patterns, and how we think about the sort of architecture of the subconscious in an era of digital manipulative processes applied to our intention and engagement. So the role of the citizen scientist and the role of these kind of ideas of DIY labs, one could argue, is to create far more of a robust engagement with critical thinking. And the idea that I think is a common overlap with everyone's presentations, whether it's Alex's or Piroska or Jill or Sid's, is that the biological or kind of the biological dimension of our current moment, CRISPR, gene editing, that's still an information science. So if you start to apply information theory, as coined by the gentleman by the name of Claude Shannon, who's a very renowned theoretician of information science, or Norbert Weiner, who coined the term cybernetics, you can easily see that there's an overlap between biological and information processes. So I'm going to be doing that residency starting in September. So I haven't generated the work yet, but I'll be at Yale for most of the autumn and spring. It's doing a series of compositions and essays. It's a writers and artists residency at their supercomputing or their quantum labs. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm not quite sure if that would put me in the same category as everyone, but hey, it's a mega mix. So thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think that we would like to know whether any of the presenters want to respond to the comments that we've just heard made.
Yes, I would like to say something actually about, I just want to read a little list of what synthetic biology, or what particularly in DIY biolabs have produced so far. I think there's, just to give you an idea what they're making. A biological blue ink, non-toxic, cheap and biodegradable. A microscope modified from a camera, a webcam. build a biosensor to measure melamine contamination in milk and estrogen hormones in milk. For general public, a DIY kit that everybody can use. Made a diagnostic tool, for example, cheap and portable, to measure malaria in Africa, to actually measure, to have a mobile diagnostic tool for having 1 drop of blood to measure malaria on the road. These are the sorts of things that, what I feel about this whole movement is that it is about improving the citizens' quality of life. I mean, this was one of the main goals. It's one of the main aims of most of the people you talk to in the bio lab movement. And I think that this sort of interest to want to collaborate also with professional scientists, which they do, to manufacture cheaper lab equipment, to control and connect to living cells, to construct better kind of biomaterials. I think this is something that's very, very worthwhile. I am a little bit concerned mostly about the way in which perhaps the emphasis is, the fact that they really haven't got their safety measures particularly in place right at the moment. And I would say that they're trying to do that, which I think is valuable.
And that's an excellent point. And just in the interest of time, because we do have time constraints, we've only got maybe 4 or 5 minutes left. So I'm going to follow Ellen's suggestion, and I know several of you have comments for one another, so just call them out.
I guess I'm stunned listening to everyone about the emphasis on knowledge as part of the thing that these citizen labs share and make available. I never put that as a category that they would produce. To me, that is an absolute fundamental right. It should be the state's responsibility to educate everyone, and scientific knowledge should be in the water, basically, from an early age until whatever. It's just, to me, the fact that that's even necessary is, and totally agree that it should be democratically available, is very problematic and is at the root of a much bigger problem, I guess.
Yeah.
Point well taken.
Yeah.
And another, I think, point that I would like to bring up is that what we're finding now is that scientists, we're running like film, photography workshops for scientists. We're in other words, using our art skills. Scientists are very much more interested now in learning the communication skills that are separate and different from their normal communication skills, like, for example, PowerPoint presentations and publications. So that's important part of being an artist in labs, is to sort of start to think about how you can bring these informations out to the public, but also how to educate the scientists in concepts of new communication.
The other way I feel artists have impacted scientists in this artisans labs or scientists in studios is the fact that artists are receptive to audience feedback. And so when you put the art out there, you iterate based on audience feedback and then go back and tinker with things. Scientists usually don't have those opportunities, whereas it's, you do some work, you put in a journal, and then that's it, you move to the next thing, or you follow up. You don't get that audience feedback. So I think participating or collaborating with artists is giving scientists the opportunity to observe the impact of that knowledge production on the audience and going back and iterating.
And one of the best things that the artists got out of Artists in Labs in our case was that they had lunch with them. They could talk outside of this, much more informal and social occasions, dinner and barbecues, where the scientists were also much more open to expressing their ethical issues and concerns.
Yeah, I was going to say that too, Jill. And I think you're hitting that, both you and Sid are hitting the nail on the head. It's these transdisciplinary interactions are so meaningful because it also creates this like very casual, easy exchange of values that then can be used to build new codes of practice, ethical structures that, you know, the traditional IRB structure doesn't always work for these situations, but then can't have nothing, right? So how do you build something from the ground up? And having all of these perspectives mixing around together freely and sharing information transparently, like you were saying, Sid, you know, not just behind a paywall of a journal, but just out there, where everyone can iterate and comment and take feedback, you know, creates the opportunity for new structures to arise that might better serve the scientific research enterprise in the future anyway, as more artists and interdisciplinary researchers get involved at all levels. So I think, yeah, it's really an important thing to have this sort of cross-pollination.
I realize
We have about 1 minute left. So last comments, anyone? Ellen.
I did want to speak to Paul's comment on computational neuroscience and information science. And Jill initially mentioned the physicality of a lot of these DIY labs. I think that's changing now, right? Because we have all this data available, and a lot of actually places are now putting the data available freely, saying you can mine it and figure out what you want with it. I think the physical aspect of it is also changing now, which is kind of really interesting.
You know, I have one last comment too, which is it's these kinds of conversations that can kind of create a critical momentum for creating more of a transdisciplinary approach to the sciences, the arts, and above all, the kind of opening the dialogue for people to feel like they're stakeholders in that conversation. I consider myself first and foremost an artist, but it was really refreshing to hear everyone's perspective. And yeah, I mean, it's a very critical moment because the pandemic, if anything, has shown us that science is never neutral, and people need to be able to engage in a robust conversation about the role of science, the arts, and how society can move forward. So I hope everyone's fully vaccinated, for example.
I'd like to add one comment to this. Besides thanking you heartily for your contributions, I wish personally we could have gotten more ferocious comments about control, which I think is really an important issue.
Yeah.
And also what I heard from everyone was a redefinition of the commons totally from what we used to define it as in an important sense.
Absolutely. And I'll just chime in and say that what came up a lot in today's conversation was about knowledge ownership and knowledge production and who has access. And these are, of course, you know, key to the issues that are driving contemporary culture today. So unfortunately, I think Ellen and I could stay on this panel for the next 6 hours. We will have to say our goodbyes and again, our heartfelt thanks to everyone. And hopefully we will have an opportunity to continue the course of this conversation another time. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. All right.